The problem of suffering, which is equivalent to the problem of evil in my mind, is one of the fundamental questions theists have to answer to defend their position. If God created the universe, then he created the set of conditions for sentient beings to exist. Since sentience cannot be separated from suffering in the universe as we know it, that means God is responsible for those beings suffering. If one thinks the suffering of innocent beings is bad, then that means God is responsible for this bad thing. So the age-old question is, if God is good, how does a good God justify creating suffering? There are various ways to answer this, and I'll give 5 here. Number 1, God is in fact good, but not flawless, as he made a mistake in creating suffering. Moreover, he is unable to fix this suffering, since a good God would want to fix it, and thus is also not all-powerful. Perhaps like an observer that regrets the horror he mistakenly created, he watches sadly as it unfolds. Number 2, God is not good. This could mean he is bad and purposely created suffering and is pleased with the outcome, or he is just neutral or amoral. In other words, just a blind creator without a particular inclination to care about the outcome one way or another. Number 3, God did not create the universe and is instead in it trying to deal with the consequences. Again, limited power would be a factor here. Number 4, God did exist and created the universe, mistakenly or not, but no longer exists. So assigning responsibility and reparations at this point in time is fruitless. Number 5, God never existed, and therefore he did not create the universe and is not morally responsible for the outcome. I should note, in this discussion, God is not necessarily any specific deity described by a religion, but can be thought of as any creator or creators that is or was a conscious entity participant in the creation of the universe and or its workings at some point in time. This leaves a door open to both natural entities such as artificial intelligence and supernatural entities such as traditional gods. The assumption that God created the universe is impossible to prove or disprove. If the universe came into being on its own without a creator, then the points I just mentioned are moot, of course. The other assumption is that suffering is bad. One does not really have to think very hard to arrive at this conclusion, as we all suffer, and we can all relate to how unpleasant this suffering is. But it is not trivial to say all suffering is bad. In fact, I don't claim that. Some suffering has instrumental value for already existing beings. What I do claim is that newly created and non-consensual suffering is always bad. Creating suffering by creating a new being that had no choice in the matter and that will suffer, and importantly, could not suffer before being created, is always bad. Part of the reason for this is that it is done without consent, but another reason is that there is the assumption that the decision to go ahead with creation was a conscious one, knowing that suffering would result. This entails knowing that the action will bring about non-consensual harm. We often call that a crime. But even if the action was carried out unknowingly, the result is still harmful. So although there might not have been malicious intent, there is still a bad outcome, and thus a negative result that should have been avoided. If we are being intellectually honest, when we are faced with the question of the existence of God, we have to ask ourselves these things. We have to take a side. Either we believe suffering of innocent beings is bad, or we don't. If it is bad, it's hard to justify a good, all-powerful God. If it is not bad, then we have to question the value of all ethical thought. After all, if it is not bad to make innocent beings suffer, then what is bad? Even if we looked at this completely selfishly and in a self-centered way, we would have to deny the fact that we ourselves would not want to suffer for something we are not guilty or responsible for. At a more mundane level, we would have to ignore how avoidance of suffering guides most of our actions. We eat to avoid hunger, we pursue money to buy things that will please us or make life easier, we entertain ourselves to feel less displeasure, etc. Not all these decisions are rational, of course. The smoker enjoys the short-term pleasure of the cigarette at the expense of likely displeasure later on, but the drive to pleasure and reduction of suffering is still the motivation. There is the middle ground of thinking not all suffering is bad, again excluding consensual instrumental suffering. This often includes or involves the idea that the suffering will be compensated later on. The problem with this assertion is lack of evidence and the high risk of being wrong. If one is wrong about avoiding suffering by not procreating, no offspring is harmed. If one is wrong about suffering being rewarded later on, one has just created suffering unnecessarily. Since I don't know of anything that definitively demonstrates evidence for this reward consistently across the board, and it is vital that it applies across the board in order for ethics to prevail, then it's obvious that the less harmful route of non-procreation is better. Going back to Proposition 1, in justifying a good God, we could choose to believe that God is suffering in his regret over creation. This would be incredibly tragic and sad, and God would deserve our pity. We all know what it feels like to make a mistake we feel awful about. But imagine being responsible for all the suffering in the world, caring about it, knowing it's your fault, and even worse, not being able to fix it. That sounds like terrible, terrible psychological torment. Ultimately, I don't know what the answer is for the theist's dilemma here, but this is the only option I can think of that a theist can choose and still be consistent in elevating ethical values. That is, believing in a God that is eternally plagued by having committed the worst mistake imaginable, about which he can do nothing substantial to remedy it. This approach tosses a lot of theology out the window, of course, but how else can a theist be consistent? Throwing up his hands and invoking the mysterious ways that God works in too conveniently removes the theist's need to think about his conclusions. And he should think about his conclusions because these ultimately affect his actions in the world. In closing, I should say the theist is just like everyone else, stuck in the world that he did not consent to come into. But despite being thrown into a situation we didn't consent to be in, however much we may not like it, we do have to make decisions. And since we should strive to avoid perpetuating the suffering that got us here, we should be responsible with our decisions and minimize the harm that comes from them. We can do better than those who are responsible for us being here. Thanks for listening.